Coming up next is part 1 of a 3-part series into what happened to Kevin Whittaker. I'm Adam. This is Southend Guy Paranormal.
Pat. Is that you, Pat? Say.
Are you a man? Right, we've got a man here.
Yeah.
Right.
Adam.
Yes.
It's John.
John Ball.
At the moment, this is Tina's pendulum. All right, now I believe we have got John Ball.
We can come and stand.
What's that?
You see that?
Okay. So. Okay. So.
In the summer of 1994, Kevin Whittaker was on track to leave his drugs past behind him. He picked up regular well-paid work that he enjoyed, kicked his cocaine habit and stopped selling drugs. And his girlfriend was expecting their first child. He had fallen foul of the law since he was a teenager. For example, he'd set fire to Kingswood Junior School when he was drunk with 2 friends. Kevin spent much of his younger life going from job to job or on the dole. He smoked cannabis frequently and would disappear for days at a time. He was never short of money. His dad suspected Kevin of drug dealing. Whittaker built up his drug dealing and was turning a profit, although much of it was spent on his cocaine habit. Whittaker had many sources for his drugs, but it was Craig Rolfe that was Kevin's favourite. Kevin started his relationship with Alison Pinkerton at the time he was dealing with Rolfe. They were getting engaged and got a home in Pitsea. In the latter part of 1993, Alison became pregnant and the baby was due to arrive in June of 1994. He'd stopped taking cocaine as he wanted to be a good dad and found good, paid work laying paving with a man called Ronnie. For the first time in his life, Kevin was stable. It all looked like Kevin had finally arrived on the straight and narrow until disaster struck. In April of 94, Kevin and Ronnie fell out and found himself out of work with a baby due. The lure to go back to Kevin's old ways was too much. Whittaker spoke to Rolfe, who offered Kevin the opportunity to become a courier for a cannabis deal with Tucker and Tate. Whittaker had to pick up the drugs from a firm in Manchester and bring them back to London. However, there was a kilo missing when they arrived. With Kevin being the courier, the debt was on him. Whittaker pleaded that the firm in Manchester must have made a mistake, that were probably trying to rip off Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Rolfe didn't want to know. The debt was on Whittaker and he had to repay it. He knew very well what Tucker was capable of. Kevin thought that he was the target of the setup and Rolfe was lining his own pockets. Unfortunately, Whittaker couldn't prove it, and that if Kevin couldn't repay the debt, his life would become hell. At the end of 94, Kevin turned up at his mother's workplace asking for help. Joan asked what the problem was, to which Kevin responded he was in trouble and needed the money to get himself out of it. Kevin said he couldn't tell his mum what the trouble was at the time, but would tell her in the future. So from here, Albert, Kevin's dad, picks up the story. Kevin sat them down, his parents. Albert said Kevin was white as a sheet and looked very frightened, and explained that he needed $2,500 for a drug debt and that he'd been a fool. Kevin said he needed to finish it and get away from the drugs business. Kevin said that if he didn't get the money, he would kill himself, jumping off of a multi-storey car park or something. Albert said that he appeared nervous and he'd never seen Kevin in a state like this. Albert said that Kevin had never talked about suicide before, so he knew that Kevin was genuinely worried. It was a bad time for Albert and Joan. They were off on holiday in a few days to the Far East, but decided to help Kevin in the hope he would come to his senses. On the 30th of September in '94, Albert made out a cheque from his building society account for £2,000. Kevin instructed his dad to make the cheque out to Russell Tate, who is Pat's younger brother. Joan gave her son £500 in cash. The following day, Albert and Joan went off on their 3-week holiday. When they returned, they discovered Kevin and Alison had split up. Kevin was now living with his friend Simon Smith. Kevin was sleeping on the sofa and very down, as he was not taking much care of his personal hygiene. On the morning of the Wednesday, the 16th of November, Kevin was getting ready to leave Simon's house. Simon offered to give Kevin a lift, but he said no as he was meeting someone. A bit later, whilst driving his car, Smith passed a Vauxhall Corsa, being driven by Rolf, and spotted Kevin in the passenger seat. Simon got home around 4 and Kevin was asleep on the settee. They spoke about what Kevin had been up to that day. Kevin said that he and Craig had been involved in a drugs deal. Kevin and Craig were both getting something that was going in a pot together to go to the same person. Kevin said that he was getting cannabis, but not about what Craig was getting. Simon asked if it was a good earner. Kevin responded that he'd be getting a few grand. The following morning, Smith gave Whittaker a lift to his parents' house. Having returned from holiday, Kevin's parents had taken charge of the situation and arranged for Alison to bring their grandson to the house each afternoon from Thursday to Monday so Kevin could have access. Alison turned up a bit later and Kevin spent the afternoon playing with his son and taking some phone calls, including one from Smith. I planned to see them that afternoon, said Smith. We'd spoken on the phone late afternoon and was waiting for a call from Craig and planned to meet up with him. When Simon turned up at Kevin's parents' house, they said he just missed Kevin. Simon never saw him again. As the evening drew on, Albert and Joan became increasingly concerned about Kevin. Whenever he left them with the baby, we'd always call every hour or so to check everything was okay. This was the first time he had not done so. Albert said Kevin had seemed fine when he went out, did not seem depressed or anything. Splitting up with Alison had upset him, but he seemed to be coping. Nearly 30 hours since Kevin had left home, Albert and Joan's worst fears had been realised when at 10 p.m. on Friday evening, when Detective Sharp and Detective Constable Mayo arrived at the house and asked whether the pair of them would be able to attend the mortuary at Basildon Hospital to assist in identification. Kevin had been found face down in a ditch on Dunton Road in Dunton, surrounded by a few odd bags of rubbish. With no signs of violence or any obvious cause of death until a close examination revealed 5 puncture marks in Kevin's right forearm and elbow. A toxicology report from the Aldermaston laboratory found that Whittaker had cocaine, ecstasy and ketamine olignocaine in his body stream. Each drug was present in high enough concentration to have caused death on its own. Police began interviewing Whittaker's friends and family to piece together his movements up until the time his body was found. It was only a matter of time before Craig Rolfe was arrested. On the 1st of December 1994, Rolfe made the following statement at Basildon Police Station. I met Whittaker at a friend's flat 5 years earlier. Over the 5 years I've got to know Kevin fairly well. Having said that, we're not particularly close, although I've done him a few favours in the past. We've only gone out together socially on one occasion. On average, I would see him 2 or 3 times a month. The last time was on Tuesday the 15th of November, around mid-afternoon, when I saw him standing in a telephone kiosk in Rectory Road, Pitsea, making a telephone call. I stopped the car I was driving, a blue Vauxhall Corsa, and had a conversation for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. I then drove off and left him to walk to Simon Smith's house. The last time I spoke to Kevin was between 3 and 4 on Thursday the 17th, when I phoned him from my home address to his father's address. The conversation lasted 5 minutes, and I can recall that he'd said he'd been to see his little boy that morning. At no time did he mention that he was worried about anything, or that he had any problems other than the fact that he was a bit down from having split with his girlfriend. That evening, I went out to friends. I received a phone call on Saturday afternoon saying Kevin was dead. Rolf's statement was supported by his girlfriend, Donna Jaggers, who testified that he was with her on the night at the time that Kevin was thought to have died. The two of them had stayed in to watch a video. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened. It was just a quiet evening in. Once the police had finished gathering evidence, the most likely explanation, it seemed, was that Kevin accidentally overdosed. He probably died at the home of a friend who was terrified of being implicated and dumped the body in a ditch. However, for Kevin's parents and close friends, that simply did not add up. For one, Kevin had a fear of needles. A few years earlier, Kevin had been bitten by a dog. His family tried to take him to hospital for a tetanus injection. Kevin kicked up such a fuss that they eventually agreed to drop the idea. Also, the puncture marks were on Kevin's right arm. Kevin was right-handed. For Kevin to inject himself in such a spot would be physically impossible. Albert said there was no way his son died by accident. It was murder, and it would take nearly 2 years for the truth to emerge. Having narrowly escaped a beating over the missing cannabis fiasco, Whittaker had been wary of dealing for Craig and Co. again, but when in November '94 they offered him the chance of coming in on another deal, it was too good an opportunity to miss. A buyer approached Rolf asking for 25 kilos of cannabis, worth around 60k, and Rolf didn't have access to that much straight away, but didn't want to lose the deal. So he stalled, whilst calling around everyone he knew in order to put the money together to make the full amount. Whittaker knew where he could get hold of a large amount of cannabis on short-term credit and at a discount for buying in bulk. Kevin realised that this was his chance to make some proper money for once. Based on his contribution, he should have made at least 5,000. But once the deal was in place, he was told he was only going to be paid 2,000. Barely enough to cover the cost of the drugs themselves, and leaving him with no profit at all. It was then that Whittaker made the biggest mistake of his life. He complained. Rolf promised to sort it out, and after discussing the situation with Tucker, called Whittaker on the Thursday to invite him over to his house on the pretext of wanting to arrange another deal to boost Whittaker's profits. At first, it all seemed plausible enough. Whittaker arrived to find Rolf, Tucker and Rolf's girlfriend in the front room drinking. Kevin was offered a beer and sat down to join the conversation. But as he drank, Kevin began to feel a little woozy, and then he found he could no longer stand or see clearly. By the time Kevin realised his drink had been spiked, it was too late. Tucker had always suspected Whittaker of stealing the missing kilo of drugs. It was Tucker who led the inquisition. "Like drugs, do you? We'll have some more. Here, have all the drugs you want." Whittaker was held down and repeatedly injected with Special K, ketamine and cocaine, while being bombarded with questions about his suppliers. Kevin finally slipped into unconsciousness, and his limp body was taken through the interior door to the garage where the Vauxhall Corsa had been hired especially for the task. Kevin was driven to Dunton, where his body was dumped. The car was valeted twice before being returned to the hire company. None of this was known when the inquest into Kevin Whittaker's death in January 1995 at Chelmsford Coroner's Court. DI Peter Hamilton explained that the police had investigated a suggestion of murder connected with a drug deal, but had no evidence. The file had been closed. The court also heard evidence from Craig Rolfe, who turned up with Tony Tucker. Craig repeated what he'd said in his statement, and the case went no further. The coroner, Dr. Malcolm Weir, had no option but to support the police line on the death that the 28-year-old had all but taken his own life. Depressed about the split from his girlfriend and the loss of his job, he had started to inject hard drugs, but had accidentally overdosed. After the inquest, Rolfe and Tucker and a few friends celebrated with a night on the town. No one would deny that they were on the up. No one could deny they had ascended to new heights of criminality, and that they were joining the ranks of the elite. They had literally got away with murder. And we're going to finish with an article from The Guardian dated the Thursday the 7th March 96, to which it says, "But police in Essex will shortly reopen their investigation into the death of Kevin Whittaker, 28, who died of an apparent drug overdose in November 1994. He was a drug courier, an associate of Rolfe. His parents and Tate's mother believe he was murdered over a drug debt. His killers, Tucker and Rolfe. Tate's mother, Marie, said her son told her about it when she visited him in hospital after he was shot. Whittaker, whose parents were horrified to discover his links with drugs, disappeared from their home on November the 17th, 1994. He had brought round his 6-month son, Lewis, but had gone out when Rolfe called him for the upteenth time. Almost 30 hours later, police arrived on the Basildon doorstep of Bert and Joan Whittaker to tell them their son had been found dumped by the roadside. That Whittaker had died from a drug overdose there was no doubt. Police, seeing needle marks on his right arm, assumed at first he was an addict. They believed his death might be suicide and other drug users had moved his body, terrified the police might prosecute them for drug offences. There was an inquest at Chelmsford a year ago. Rolfe, called to give evidence, at first denied knowing Whittaker, then admitted he had called him when confronted with itemised phone bills. We realised there was more to her son's death, said Joan Whittaker, 64. And then Mrs. Tate, after the deaths, claimed Tucker and Rolfe had injected Whittaker in the groin with a paralysing drug often used on horses known as Special K. The victim is powerless but conscious. Whittaker was then injected with lignocaine and died. Mrs. Tate thinks Whittaker's friends avenged his death. Her son was the innocent party. But Whittaker was small fry, and although police now believe Rolfe and Tucker murdered him, they feel it had nothing to do with last December's events at Workhouse Lane. Dibley, who remains strangely bullish, has made one arrest. A 27-year-old decorator from South London who was held in joint operation with Scotland Yard and was charged with firearms offences. He is remanded in custody. We're not frustrated. You only get frustrated when there's no work to do, and there's plenty to be done. I am happy with how our inquiry is proceeding, and I'm hopeful of arrests before I retire. It's how I would want to end a 32-year career. So there we go. That is the first of 3 parts into the investigation of Kevin Whittaker. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Take care. Thank you. Love and light to you all. God bless.